The gunshot echoed across the canyon walls like thunder, silencing the jeers of the three outlaws who had been dragging Nora Valenti toward their camp. The rope binding her wrists suddenly went slack, severed by a well-aimed bullet. Before she could register what happened, a tall figure on horseback appeared, swooping down beside her. Strong arms lifted her from the dirt path and onto the saddle in one fluid motion as the outlaws scrambled for their weapons. "Hold tight," the man ordered, his voice deep and steady against the frantic beating of her heart. Nora clung to him as the horse lunged forward, powerful muscles propelling them away from danger while more gunshots cracked through the air behind them. Colorado Territory, 1872. The setting sun painted the mountains gold as Nora and her rescuer rode hard toward the rocky outcropping ahead. Her hands, raw from the rough hemp rope, gripped his leather vest while the wind whipped her copper hair free from its pins. She had no choice but to trust this stranger who'd appeared from nowhere like an avenging angel. Only when they reached a hidden ravine did the man slow his mount, guiding the exhausted horse between towering stone walls that offered protection from prying eyes. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they traveled deeper into the sanctuary. "We should be safe here for now," he said, finally bringing the horse to a halt beside a small stream. "Those men won't find us before nightfall, and they aren't foolish enough to track in the dark." When he helped her down, Nora's legs nearly buckled beneath her. The events of the day, the stagecoach robbery, being taken hostage, and now this daring rescue had drained her completely. The man caught her elbow to steady her, and she got her first clear look at him. He stood at least a foot taller than her, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin. His eyes were a striking blue beneath the brim of his worn Stetson, a stark contrast to his dark beard. Dust covered his clothes, but there was something refined about him despite the rugged appearance. "Thank you," Nora said, finding her voice at last. "Those men, they were taking me to their camp, and no need to explain," he interrupted, then softened his tone. "Name's Preston Archer. Most folks just call me Prees." "Nora Valenti," she replied, wincing as she tried to rub circulation back into her wrists. Preston took a canteen from his saddle and offered it to her. "Drink. Then let me see those wrists." She accepted gratefully, the cool water bringing immediate relief to her parched throat. When she'd finished, Preston gently took her hands, examining the angry red marks where the rope had cut into her skin. "We need to clean these," he said, leading her to the stream. "Cold water will help with the swelling." As she knelt beside him at the water's edge, Nora studied her rescuer more carefully. His movements were precise and confident, his hands calloused but gentle as they helped bathe her wounded wrists. "How did you find me?" she asked. "Were you following the stagecoach?" Preston shook his head. "I've been tracking those three for 2 days. They're wanted for a bank robbery in Pueblo. When I saw them drag you from the stagecoach, I had to change my plans." "You're a lawman?" Nora asked, noticing for the first time the silver badge partially concealed beneath his vest. "Deputy Marshal," he confirmed. "Though at the moment, I'm a fair distance outside my jurisdiction." Darkness was settling over the ravine, and Preston moved to gather wood for a small fire. "We'll need to stay here tonight. It's not safe to travel these trails after dark, especially with those outlaws still out there." Nora wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling the chill of the mountain evening. Her traveling dress, once crisp and proper for her journey, was now torn and dirty. She'd lost her bonnet hours ago when the outlaws had first pulled her from the stagecoach. "Here," Preston said, draping a wool blanket around her shoulders. "It's not much, but it'll keep you warm." As he built a small, sheltered fire, Nora watched his methodical movements. "Why were you traveling alone?" he asked without looking up from his work. I wasn't. There were 5 other passengers on the coach, including an elderly couple. When the outlaws attacked, the driver was shot. Her voice caught as she recalled the terrible moment. The other passengers were robbed and left behind, but they took me. Preston nodded grimly. The Blackwell gang has a reputation for taking hostages when they need leverage, though they don't usually target women traveling alone. I wasn't meant to be alone, Nora said, staring into the small flames that now flickered between them. My brother was supposed to meet me at the station in Denver, but he never arrived. I waited 3 days before deciding to continue to Granite on my own. Granite, that's where you're headed. Preston looked up with renewed interest. Yes. My father passed away last month, and I've inherited his share in a mine there. I came to settle his affairs and decide what to do with the property. Preston's expression changed, though Nora couldn't quite read it in the firelight. The mining town is rough country for a woman alone. I'm not as delicate as I appear, Marshal Archer, she replied with more confidence than she felt. My father taught me to handle difficult situations. Just not outlaws with ropes, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. Despite everything, Nora found herself smiling back. No, I admit that was beyond my experience. As the night deepened around them, Preston shared his simple provisions: jerky, hardtack, and coffee brewed over the small fire. They spoke little, both exhausted from the day's events, but Nora felt strangely comforted by his presence. When it came time to sleep, Preston insisted she take his bedroll while he kept watch. I'll wake you before dawn, he said, checking his revolver before settling against a boulder with a clear view of the ravine entrance. We'll reach Granite by midday tomorrow if we make good time. And the outlaws? She asked, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. They'll be looking for us, but I know these mountains better than they do. Rest now, Miss Valenti. You're safe. As Nora drifted toward sleep, she wondered about the mysterious deputy marshal who had risked his life to save hers. There was more to Preston Archer than met the eye. Something in the way he spoke of Granite suggested he knew the town well. Despite her exhaustion and fear, she found herself curious about the man whose steady presence now stood between her and danger. Morning came too quickly, with Preston gently shaking her awake while the sky was still gray with pre-dawn light. He had already saddled his horse and extinguished all traces of their fire. We need to move, he said, offering her a hand up. I spotted dust about 3 miles back. Could be our friends from yesterday. Nora quickly folded the blanket while Preston secured their few belongings. Within minutes, they were mounted and moving through the ravine, following the stream as it wound between the rocky walls. The horse will struggle with both of us for long stretches, Preston explained as they emerged from the ravine into a pine forest. But there's a trading post about 5 miles ahead where we might be able to acquire another mount. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and sage. Under different circumstances, Nora might have found the ride pleasant. The stunning vistas as they crested each rise, the wildflowers dotting the meadows they passed. But the constant threat of pursuit kept her tense, listening for hoofbeats behind them. Preston seemed to sense her anxiety. Tell me about your father's mine, he said, clearly trying to distract her. Silver or gold? Silver, Nora replied, grateful for the conversation. The Morning Star mine. My father acquired it 6 years ago, just before he sent me back east to school. I haven't seen it myself, but his letters described it as promising. The Morning Star, Preston repeated, his tone thoughtful. That's on the North Ridge, if I recall correctly. Good location, though the ore quality varied widely in that area. You know it. Nora twisted slightly to look at him. I know most of the mines around Granite, he said, his expression unreadable beneath his hat. It's part of my job. They rode in silence for a while, until the trees thinned and revealed a small wooden building nestled in a clearing ahead. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and several horses were tethered to a hitching post out front. Foster's trading post, Preston explained, slowing their pace. Old man Foster's been here since before the war. He's fair in his dealings, if a bit eccentric. As they approached, Nora noticed a wiry man with a long white beard exit the building. He squinted at them, then broke into a wide grin when he recognized Preston. "Well, I'll be damned." "Preston Archer," the man called, hobbling toward them with the aid of a carved walking stick. "Thought you'd gone and got yourself killed chasing those bank robbers." Preston dismounted and helped Nora down before clasping the old man's hand. "Still breathing, Foster. Though it was a close call yesterday." The old man's eyes shifted to Nora, taking in her disheveled appearance and the marks on her wrists. "I see you've got yourself in another fine mess. Who's the lady?" "Nora Valenti," Preston said. "Miss Valenti, this is Ezra Foster, the most overpriced merchant in Colorado Territory." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Valenti," Foster said with a slight bow. "Don't believe a word this rascal says about my prices. I'm practically giving merchandise away these days." Despite herself, Nora smiled at the old man's charm. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Foster." "We need another horse," Preston said, getting to business, "and fresh supplies. The Blackwell gang is on our trail and we need to reach Granite by midday." Foster's expression darkened at the mention of the Outlaws. "Heard they hit a stage-coach yesterday. That you're doing, miss?" "I was a passenger," Nora confirmed. "Marshal Archer intervened when they attempted to take me to their camp." "Lucky for you," Foster muttered, then turned to Preston. "I've got a bay mare that might suit the lady. Not as fast as your gelding, but she's sure-footed on mountain trails." While Foster went to prepare the horse, Preston led Nora inside the trading post. The single room was crammed with goods of every description: tools, clothing, preserved foods, ammunition, and even a few books. A pot of coffee simmered on the small stove in the corner. "Help yourself," Preston said, nodding toward the coffee. "I'll gather what we need." Nora gratefully poured herself a cup, wrapping her hands around the warm tin. She watched as Preston efficiently collected supplies: jerky, beans, coffee, ammunition for his revolver, and a small medical kit. "You should consider some more practical attire," he suggested, gesturing to her torn traveling dress. "Foster keeps some women's clothing for passing travelers. Nothing fancy, but more suitable for riding than what you're wearing." Nora glanced down at her impractical garment. "I suppose you're right, though I hadn't planned on an extended horseback journey when I packed." In a curtained alcove at the back of the store, Nora found a simple blue cotton dress, a riding skirt, and a man's cotton shirt that would serve as a blouse. She changed quickly, grateful to be free of the tattered dress she'd been wearing since yesterday. The new clothes were plain but sturdy and far more practical for their journey. When she emerged, Preston was settling their account with Foster. He turned at her approach, and she didn't miss the quick appraisal in his gaze before he returned to business. "The mare is saddled and ready," Foster was saying, "and I threw in some extra ammunition. Word is those Blackwell boys acquired a Winchester rifle in their last robbery." "Much obliged," Preston said, handing over several coins. "If anyone comes asking after us, never saw hide nor hair of you," Foster finished with a wink. "Been too busy with all my other customers, you see." He gestured around the empty store with a chuckle. Outside, Nora found a sturdy bay mare waiting beside Preston's gelding. Foster had provided a woman's saddle, complete with a side horn that would allow her to ride properly even in a dress. "You ride, I assume?" Preston asked as he secured their supplies. Yes, though it's been some time, Nora admitted, approaching the mare and letting the animal sniff her hand. My father insisted I learn when I was young. Good. We'll make better time separated than doubling up. As Preston helped her mount, Foster emerged from the trading post with a wrapped package. Almost forgot, he said, handing it up to Nora. Bit of sourdough bread and preserves. A lady shouldn't have to survive on jerky and beans. Nora smiled warmly at the old man. Thank you, Mr. Foster. You're very kind. Take care of her, please, Foster said, his expression serious as he stepped back. Those Blackwell boys aren't known for forgiveness when crossed. Preston nodded grimly, swinging into his saddle. We'll be careful. Send word to Sheriff Morgan in Granite that we're coming, and that we might have trouble on our heels. With a final farewell to the old trader, they set off toward the mountain trail that would lead them to Granite. The mare proved to be an excellent mount, responding easily to Nora's commands as they navigated the increasingly rugged terrain. You ride well, Preston observed after they'd been traveling for about an hour. Your father taught you? Yes, on our farm in Pennsylvania. He said a woman should always be able to depend on herself. Nora adjusted her hat, a practical item Foster had insisted she take to protect against the sun. Though I admit, I never imagined these skills would be quite so essential. Your father sounds like a wise man, Preston said. Was he in mining before coming west? No. He was a blacksmith by trade, but always dreamed of finding silver. When my mother passed, there was nothing keeping him in Pennsylvania. I was already 16 by then, old enough for the finishing school in Boston my aunt had arranged. A shadow crossed her face. I sometimes wonder if he was lonely out here. His letters were always optimistic, full of plans for the mine, but he rarely mentioned friends or companions. Preston was quiet for a moment. Mining towns can be solitary places, despite all the people. Men come seeking fortunes, not friendships, but your father was well regarded in Granite from what I've heard. You knew him? Nora asked, surprised. Not well, Preston admitted, but his reputation was solid. Honest in his dealings, which is rare enough in mining communities. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the trail gradually climbing higher into the mountains. Around mid-morning, Preston signaled for a stop at a vantage point overlooking the valley they'd traversed. While the horses drank from a small spring, Preston scanned the valley with a brass spyglass. His expression tightened as he focused on something in the distance. Riders, he said grimly. 3 of them moving fast. Has to be the Blackwell gang. Nora felt her heart quicken. How far behind? Few hours at most. They're pushing their horses hard. Preston collapsed the spyglass and turned to her. We have 2 choices. We can make for Granite directly, it's about 3 hours' ride from here, or we can try to lose them in the high country. Which would you recommend? Nora asked, trusting his experience. Preston studied the trail ahead, weighing their options. The high country route is more difficult, but it gives us the advantage. Those men know the main trail to Granite as well as I do, but the old mining paths through the upper ridges are less familiar to them. Then we take the high country, Nora said decisively. Preston's eyes met hers, appraising. It won't be easy riding. I'm not afraid of difficult paths, Marshal Archer. I've come too far to be deterred now. A hint of admiration flickered across his face. Very well. Stay close and follow my lead. They mounted again and veered from the main trail onto a barely visible path that wound steeply upward through a dense pine forest. The going was immediately more challenging, with the horses having to pick their way around fallen trees and loose stones. This was an old prospector's trail, Preston explained as they climbed. Hasn't been used much since the big companies moved in with their industrial operations, but it cuts through to Granite from the north side, where they won't expect us." The air grew thinner as they ascended, and Nora found herself breathing more heavily. The views, however, were spectacular, vast expanses of wilderness stretching to the horizon, the snow-capped peaks of the Continental Divide gleaming in the distance. By early afternoon, they had reached a high alpine meadow dotted with wildflowers. Preston called for another brief rest to water the horses and check their back trail. "No sign of them yet," he reported, though his expression remained vigilant. "But they're persistent, especially their leader, Frank Blackwell. You seem to know a lot about these outlaws," Nora observed, accepting the water canteen he offered. "I've been tracking their gang for months," Preston replied, his jaw tightening. "They've hit banks and stage coaches across 3 territories, but this is the first time they've taken a hostage." "Why me?" Nora asked the question that had been troubling her since the robbery. "There were wealthier passengers on that stage coach." Preston hesitated as though debating how much to tell her. "I have a theory," he finally said, "but you might not like it. I'd rather know the truth, however unpleasant." "The Morning Star mine," he said simply. "It's become valuable recently, more valuable than your father may have realized before he passed." Nora stared at him. "But how would they know about my connection to the mine? I only arrived in Colorado a week ago." News travels fast in mining country, especially news about property changing hands. If word got out that Jacob Valenti's daughter was coming to claim his mine. Preston let the implication hang in the air. "You think they plan to use me to gain control of the mine?" Nora felt a chill despite the afternoon sun. "It's possible. Frank Blackwell has been branching out from simple robbery. Several mining claims have changed hands under suspicious circumstances in the last year." This new information cast her situation in an even more dangerous light. It wasn't just about escaping outlaws now, her very inheritance was at stake. "We should keep moving," Preston said, helping her back onto her horse. "If we push hard, we can reach the ridge above Granite by sunset." The trail grew increasingly treacherous as they continued, sometimes narrowing to barely the width of a horse's hooves along steep drop-offs. Nora fought to control her fear, focusing instead on keeping her mare calm and following Preston's lead. Late in the afternoon, they reached a high pass where the trail split. Preston reined in, studying both options with a frown. "Something wrong?" Nora asked, drawing alongside him. "The eastern fork is faster, but it's exposed along that ridgeline," he explained, pointing to a narrow trail that skirted a barren slope. "The western fork is longer but offers more cover." Before he could decide, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed through the mountains. Preston's horse reared as a bullet struck a rock just beside them, sending fragments flying. "Ride!" Preston shouted, spurring his gelding toward the western fork. "They've found us!" Nora urged her mare forward, ducking low in the saddle as more shots rang out behind them. The western trail plunged immediately into a dense stand of pines, providing cover from their pursuers, but the footing was treacherous with exposed roots and sudden dips. Preston led them at a punishing pace, weaving between trees and across small ravines. Nora focused entirely on staying in the saddle, trusting her mare's instincts on the difficult terrain. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as they descended through the forest, but Preston showed no sign of slowing. When they finally emerged from the tree line, the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across a narrow valley. Below them, Nora could see the scattered buildings of a town Granite, she presumed nestled at the base of the mountains with mining structures dotting the surrounding slopes. "We made it," she breathed, relief washing over her. "Not quite yet," Preston cautioned. "This trail joins the main road about a mile outside town. We're still vulnerable until we reach the sheriff's office." As they picked their way down the steep trail toward the valley floor, Nora studied the town that was to be her new home. It was larger than she'd imagined from her father's letters, with at least 100 buildings spread along a main street and several side roads. She could make out a church steeple, the larger structures of mercantiles and hotels, and numerous saloons with their distinctive facades. "Is it what you expected?" Preston asked, noticing her interest. "It's bigger," she admitted. "Father's letters made it sound like little more than a camp. It's grown quickly in the last year." The Stewart Mining Company opened a new operation on the South Ridge that brought in fresh workers and businesses to support them. The mention of a mining company stirred something in Nora's memory. Stewart Mining. They sent an offer to purchase my father's claim about 6 months ago. He refused. Preston gave her a sharp look. Did he say why? Only that he believed the Morning Star would eventually prove more valuable than their offer suggested. She frowned, recalling details from her father's correspondence. He mentioned finding a new vein just before he fell ill. "Interesting," Preston murmured, though he didn't elaborate further. As the trail joined the main road to town, Preston urged their horses to a faster pace. The first buildings were just ahead: a livery stable, a blacksmith shop, and what appeared to be a way station for stage coaches. They had almost reached the edge of town when 3 riders emerged from a side trail, cutting directly into their path. Nora recognized them immediately: the Blackwell gang, led by a tall man with a distinctive scar running down his left cheek. "Well now, Deputy Marshal," the scarred man called, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Thought you'd given us the slip, did you?" Preston halted their horses, positioning himself slightly in front of Nora. His hand hovered near his holster. "It's over, Frank. We're at the town limits. Sheriff Morgan will have men watching for us." Frank Blackwell laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Morgan's boys are dealing with a situation at the Stewart mine. Convenient explosion in one of the shafts about an hour ago." His cold eyes shifted to Nora. "No one's coming to help you." Nora felt her blood run cold. These men had planned everything meticulously. "The lady and I have unfinished business," Blackwell continued. "Step aside, Marshal, and you might walk away from this." "That's not going to happen," Preston replied, his voice steady. "Miss Valenti is under my protection." The tension crackled between them like lightning before a storm. Nora could see Preston calculating their options, which seemed increasingly limited. "Last chance, Archer," Blackwell warned, his hand moving toward his gun. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Nora barely had time to register it. Preston drew his revolver with lightning speed, firing twice before the outlaws could react. One of Blackwell's men tumbled from his saddle, while another clutched his shoulder, his own gun unfired. Blackwell himself managed to get off a shot that grazed Preston's arm before retreating behind a large boulder at the side of the road. His remaining companion followed suit, leaving their wounded ally moaning in the dust. "Ride for town." Preston shouted to Nora, returning fire to keep the outlaws pinned down. "Get to the sheriff's office on Main Street." "I won't leave you," Nora protested, even as bullets whizzed past them. "Go," Preston insisted. "I'll be right behind you." Seeing the determination in his eyes, Nora finally nodded and spurred her mare toward town. The animal responded instantly, galloping down the main road as buildings blurred on either side. Behind her, the gunfire continued, punctuated by shouts and the thundering of hooves. Townsfolk scattered from her path, staring in shock at the woman riding full tilt down their main street with gunfire echoing behind her. Nora scanned the buildings frantically until she spotted a wooden structure with "Sheriff" painted above the door. She reined in sharply, nearly tumbling from the saddle in her haste to dismount. As she stumbled toward the door, it burst open to reveal a barrel-chested man with a silver star on his vest. "Marshal Archer sent me," she gasped. "Outlaws the Blackwell gang at the edge of town. Inside, madam," the sheriff ordered, already calling to deputies who appeared from a back room. "Blackwell gang at the north entrance. Move." Nora was ushered into the safety of the sheriff's office as armed men rushed past her toward the gunfire. Through the window, she watched anxiously as the lawmen fanned out, taking positions along the street. More shots echoed, then a sudden silence fell. The minutes stretched endlessly as Nora waited, her heart pounding in her ears. Had Preston been hit? Had the outlaws escaped? Finally, she saw movement at the far end of the street. Two deputies were leading a man with his hands bound behind his back, one of the Blackwell gang members. Behind them came more figures, and Nora pressed her face to the glass, searching for Preston's familiar silhouette. When she saw him riding slowly toward the sheriff's office, relief washed over her like a wave. His left arm was bandaged with what looked like a torn piece of shirt, but he sat tall in the saddle, escorting a second prisoner, Frank Blackwell himself, his face contorted with fury. Nora rushed outside as they approached, unable to contain her concern. "You're wounded," she called, hurrying to meet Preston as he dismounted stiffly. "Just a graze," he assured her, though the makeshift bandage was stained with blood. Sheriff Morgan's timing was perfect. The sheriff himself approached, clapping Preston on his uninjured shoulder. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon, Prees, especially not with Frank Blackwell in tow. We brought trouble to your doorstep, Tom. Sorry about that." Sheriff Morgan shook his head. "Been wanting to put Blackwell behind bars for months. You just saved us the trouble of hunting him down." He turned to Nora, tipping his hat respectfully. "You must be Jacob Valenti's daughter. We received word you were coming, though not quite like this." "Nora Valenti," she confirmed, extending her hand. "It seems I have you and Marshal Archer to thank for my safe arrival." "Let's get inside," the sheriff suggested, noting the growing crowd of curious onlookers. "Doc Wilson's office is just down the street, Prees. You should have that arm looked at." "The arm can wait," Preston said firmly. "We need to talk about what happened at the Stewart mine first." The sheriff's expression darkened. "Convenient timing, wasn't it? Almost like someone knew we'd need a distraction." Inside the sheriff's office, while deputies secured the prisoners in cells at the back, Preston explained everything that had transpired since the stagecoach robbery. Nora added details about her father's mine and the offer from Stewart Mining Company. "It fits a pattern," Sheriff Morgan said grimly when they'd finished. "Stewart's been buying up smaller claims all over the district. Most folks sell willingly, they offer good prices. But there have been accidents, threats, mysterious fires when people refuse. And now they're working with outlaws." Nora asked, appalled. "Can't prove it yet," the sheriff replied. "But this isn't the first time Blackwell has shown up when Stewart wanted something." Preston winced as he adjusted his injured arm. "What about the explosion today?" "Minor one, fortunately. No casualties, but it pulled every deputy I had away from town for a crucial hour." Morgan's expression was troubled. "Someone knew exactly when you'd be arriving." "Someone inside Stewart Mining," Preston concluded. "Someone who knew about Miss Valenti's arrival and coordinated with Blackwell." Nora felt overwhelmed by these revelations. What had begun as a simple journey to settle her father's affairs had become entangled in a web of corporate greed and outlaw violence. "You need a safe place to stay tonight," Sheriff Morgan said to her, "and Preston needs that arm tended to. Mrs. Wilson, the doctor's wife, runs a boarding house next to his office. She's discreet and her doors have good locks. I should check on the Morning Star property, Nora began, but Preston interrupted. Not tonight, he said firmly. Not until we know exactly what we're dealing with. Recognizing the wisdom in his caution, Nora nodded. Very well, but tomorrow I want to see my father's mine. I'll escort you personally, Preston promised, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart quicken. Sheriff Morgan arranged for a deputy to accompany them to the doctor's office and then to the boarding house. As they prepared to leave, Nora turned back to Preston. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. I wouldn't have survived this day without you. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight curve of his lips. Just doing my job, Miss Valenti. But they both knew it was more than that. Something had formed between them during their harrowing journey, a connection forged in danger and shared purpose. As they walked out into the gathering darkness of Granite, Nora realized that despite all the peril she'd faced, she felt strangely at home in this rough mining town, with this enigmatic lawman at her side. Dr. Wilson proved to be a competent physician with a gentle manner, despite his gruff appearance. He cleaned and properly bandaged Preston's wound, declaring him lucky that the bullet had only grazed the muscle. Keep it clean and try not to use that arm too much for a few days, the doctor advised as he finished his work. And consider yourself fortunate, Marshal. An inch to the right and we'd be having a very different conversation. Wouldn't be the first bullet I've dodged, Preston replied with a wry smile that did little to mask the pain Nora knew he must be feeling. Mrs. Wilson, a plump, motherly woman with kind eyes, appeared at the door of the examination room. Your room is ready, Miss Valenti. And I've prepared one for the marshal as well, just across the hall. The boarding house was a tidy two-story structure attached to the doctor's office. Inside, polished wood floors and simple but elegant furnishings created a welcoming atmosphere that immediately put Nora at ease. After days of travel and danger, the prospect of a clean room and proper bed seemed like unimaginable luxury. I've drawn a bath for you, dear, Mrs. Wilson said, leading Nora upstairs, and laid out a nightgown. It belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Denver, but it should fit you well enough until your things arrive. My things? Nora asked, confused. From your father's house, Mrs. Wilson explained. Sheriff Morgan sent a deputy to collect what you might need for tonight. Your father's home has been closed up since he passed, but everything inside is yours now. The thought of her father's house, a place she had never seen, but that contained the last traces of his life, brought a sudden lump to Nora's throat. Thank you, she managed. You're very kind. It's no trouble at all. Now you get cleaned up and rested. Supper will be ready in an hour, and I expect you and the marshal to join us. You both look like you could use a proper meal. Left alone in the comfortable bedroom, Nora sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the past 2 days finally catching up to her. She allowed herself a moment of tears for her father, for the danger she'd survived, for the uncertain future that awaited her. Then, drawing a deep breath, she gathered herself. Her father had raised her to be strong, to face challenges head-on. She would honor his memory by confronting whatever lay ahead with the same courage and determination that had seen her through this far. The hot bath Mrs. Wilson had prepared was heavenly, washing away not just the dust of the trail but some of the tension from Nora's body. By the time she dressed in the borrowed nightgown and wrapper, she felt almost human again. Supper was served in a small dining room where Dr. Wilson and 2 other boarders, a young schoolteacher and an elderly accountant who worked for one of the mining companies, joined them at the table. Preston arrived last, freshly bathed and wearing a clean shirt that Mrs. Wilson had somehow procured for him. Nora noticed that despite his injury and obvious fatigue, he carried himself with an alertness that suggested he was never truly off duty. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, and he positioned himself with his back to the wall, facing the door. The meal was simple but delicious: roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and a berry cobbler for dessert. The conversation remained deliberately light, with no mention of outlaws or mining disputes. Yet Nora was acutely aware of Preston's presence across the table, his occasional glances meeting hers with unspoken understanding. After dinner, while the others retired to the parlor for coffee, Preston invited Nora to step onto the small back porch for a moment of privacy. The night was clear, with thousands of stars visible above the mountains that encircled the town. From this vantage point, Nora could see the scattered lights of Granite spreading through the valley, and higher up, the occasional lantern from a mine entrance or cabin. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Different from Pennsylvania, but beautiful in its own way." Preston nodded, leaning against the porch railing. "The mountains get in your blood. I tried living back east for a time, but I couldn't stay away." "Is that where you're from originally?" "Boston," he confirmed. "My father was a judge. He expected me to follow him into law." "And instead you became a lawman of a different sort," Nora observed. A smile touched his lips. "Not exactly what he had in mind, but out here justice often needs a more immediate approach than courtrooms can provide." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the town piano music from a saloon, the occasional shout or laugh, the rhythmic hammering from a late working blacksmith. "What will you do about the mine?" Preston finally asked, turning to face her directly. Nora sighed. "I don't know yet. I need to see it first, understand what my father was building." She met his gaze steadily. "And I need to know more about Stewart Mining Company and their interest in it." "They're powerful," Preston warned. "Owned by a man named Edmund Stewart. He came from San Francisco about 2 years ago with significant financial backing. He's been expanding aggressively ever since." "You think he was behind what happened today? The Outlaws, the explosion?" Preston's expression darkened. "I can't prove it yet. But yes, I believe Stewart is using Blackwell and his gang to acquire properties that aren't willingly sold." "Then my father—" Nora couldn't finish the thought. "Your father's death was reported as natural causes," Preston said gently. "Pneumonia, according to the doctor." "There's no evidence of foul play." Nora nodded, taking some comfort in that knowledge. "Still, if Stewart wants the Morning Star badly enough to arrange my kidnapping, I need to understand why." "We'll find out," Preston promised. "Tomorrow we'll visit the mine and your father's house. Between Sheriff Morgan's investigation and what we discover, we'll get to the truth." The conviction in his voice reassured her. Despite knowing him for just over a day, Nora trusted Preston Archer implicitly. He had saved her life, protected her, and now stood beside her in this unfamiliar world that was suddenly hers to navigate. "Thank you for staying," she said. "You could have handed me over to the sheriff's care and returned to your own duties." Preston's blue eyes held hers in the dim light of the porch lantern. "My duties include seeing this through, Miss Valenti. Until I'm certain you're safe, I'm not going anywhere." The intensity of his gaze stirred something within her, a warmth that had nothing to do with danger or fear. For the first time since her ordeal began, Nora felt something like anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. "Then I look forward to exploring my inheritance with you, Marshal Archer," she said with a small smile. "Preston," he corrected softly. "After what we've been through, I think we've earned the right to first names." "Preston," she repeated, liking the way it felt on her lips. "And you must call me Nora." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Eventually, Mrs. Wilson called them inside, insisting they both needed rest after their ordeal. As Preston escorted her to her bedroom door, Nora found herself reluctant for the day to end, despite her exhaustion. There was something about his presence that made her feel both protected and alive in ways she had never experienced. "Good night, Nora," he said, his voice low and warm. "Rest well." "Good night, Preston," she replied. "Thank you again for saving my life today." For a moment, he looked as though he might say something more. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes communicating what words could not, before turning to his own room across the hall. As Nora closed her door and prepared for bed, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 2 days. She had come to Colorado expecting to quietly settle her father's affairs and perhaps sell his mining claim. Now she found herself in the middle of a dangerous conflict, with powerful enemies and unexpected allies. And at the center of it all was Preston Archer, the deputy marshal whose steady presence had become her anchor in this storm. As sleep finally claimed her, Nora's last thoughts were of blue eyes and the promise of tomorrow. The morning brought clear skies and renewed purpose. Nora awoke early, feeling surprisingly refreshed despite everything that had happened. Mrs. Wilson had arranged for some suitable clothes to be delivered, a practical riding outfit, and boots that fit Nora remarkably well. "Sheriff's wife contributed these," Mrs. Wilson explained as she helped Nora with her hair. "About your size, and she said you're welcome to them until you get settled." "The people of Granite are incredibly generous," Nora observed, touched by these kindnesses from strangers. "We look after our own," Mrs. Wilson replied simply. "And Jacob Valenti's daughter is one of our own." Downstairs, Nora found Preston already at the breakfast table, deep in conversation with Dr. Wilson. He rose when she entered, and she noted that despite the bandage visible beneath his rolled sleeve, he moved with more ease than the previous evening. "Good morning," he greeted her, pulling out her chair. "I was just discussing our plans for today with the doctor, and trying to convince him that his injury doesn't require further rest," Dr. Wilson added with a pointed look at Preston. "Stubborn as a mule, this one." "I'm well enough to ride," Preston insisted. "And we have matters that can't wait." Over a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits, Preston outlined what he had learned from Sheriff Morgan that morning. "Frank Blackwell is talking, trying to save himself from the gallows," he explained, keeping his voice low though they were alone in the dining room. "He's admitted that Stewart Mining hired his gang to intercept you, but claims he doesn't know the full extent of their plans. You believe him?" Nora asked, mindful of Mrs. Wilson moving about in the kitchen. "Partially. Blackwell is smart enough to have kept some leverage for himself. He knows names, dates, payments made enough to implicate several of Stewart's men, but he's insisting that Edmund Stewart himself was never directly involved." "Convenient," Nora remarked skeptically. "Indeed, but it gives us something to work with." Preston lowered his voice further. "Sheriff Morgan has deputies watching Stewart's office and home. If he tries to flee or destroy evidence, they'll know." After breakfast, they walked to the livery stable where fresh horses awaited them. Sheriff Morgan had arranged for a deputy named Collins to accompany them to the Morning Star mine, a precaution that Preston insisted upon despite Nora's protests that she didn't need an entire escort. "Until we know exactly who's involved in this conspiracy, we're not taking chances," he said firmly as they mounted. "Besides, Collins knows these mountains better than anyone. He's worked most of the mines around Granite at one time or another." Deputy Collins proved to be a taciturn young man with a weathered face that made him look older than his probable years. He nodded politely to Nora, but said little as they rode out of town, taking a winding trail that climbed steadily into the northern foothills. As they ascended, Granite grew smaller behind them, the town's layout becoming clear from this elevation. Nora could see the main street running east to west, with smaller roads branching off it like tributaries from a river. Mining operations dotted the surrounding mountains, identifiable by their wooden structures and the occasional puff of steam or smoke. "Which ones belong to Stewart Mining?" she asked, gesturing to the various operations visible from their vantage point. "Most of the larger ones on the south and east slopes," Collins replied, breaking his silence. "The biggest is the Queen's Fortune on the southeast ridge. That's Stewart's flagship mine, where the explosion happened yesterday. They've consolidated about a dozen smaller claims in the past year." "And the Morning Star?" Nora prompted. "Where is it from here?" Collins pointed to a distant northern slope. "Just beyond that ridge. It's smaller than Stewart's operations but well positioned. Your father chose the location wisely." They rode for another hour, climbing higher into the mountains along increasingly narrow trails. The air grew cooler, and Nora was grateful for the warm jacket Mrs. Wilson had provided. Pine and spruce trees surrounded them, occasionally opening to reveal spectacular vistas of the valley below. Finally, they crested a ridge and Collins pointed ahead. "There it is, the Morning Star." Nora reined in her horse, taking in her first view of her inheritance. Unlike the industrial operations she had glimpsed from town, the Morning Star was relatively modest, a main shaft entrance reinforced with timber, a small ore processing building, and several outbuildings clustered nearby. A creek ran alongside the property, powering a water wheel that presumably drove some of the equipment. Most striking was the location nestled in a protected bowl on the mountainside with excellent southern exposure. Even to Nora's untrained eye, it was an ideal setting. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Your father had an eye for land," Preston observed, drawing up beside her. "This location is sheltered from the worst winter storms but gets sun most of the day." As they approached the mine entrance, Nora noticed signs of recent activity: fresh lumber stacked beside one building, tools laid out as though the workers had just stepped away for lunch. "I thought operations would have ceased when my father died," she said, puzzled. Collins dismounted and examined the area. "Someone's been working here recently. Within the last few days, I'd say." Preston's hand moved to his revolver as he surveyed the site. "Collins, check the outbuildings. I'll examine the main shaft. Nora, stay with the horses for now." Nora wanted to protest, but recognized the caution in Preston's tone. She remained mounted, watching as the two men carefully investigated the property. Collins disappeared into the largest outbuilding while Preston approached the mine entrance, drawing his gun before stepping inside. The minutes stretched uncomfortably as Nora waited, every sense alert for danger. She found herself holding her breath when Collins emerged from the outbuilding, carrying something in his hands. "Marshal," he called, urgency in his voice. "You need to see this." Preston emerged from the mine shaft and hurried to where Collins stood. Nora could no longer contain her curiosity and dismounted, leading the horses as she joined the two men. Collins had spread a map on a barrel outside the building. "Found this hidden in a compartment beneath the foreman's desk," he explained. "It's a survey map of this entire ridge." Preston studied it intently, his expression grave. "These markings, they indicate a new vein." "Not just any vein," Collins replied. "Look at the direction and depth. If these readings are accurate, this is the same silver vein that feeds Stewart's Queen's Fortune mine, but at a purer concentration." "The Queen's Fortune is Stewart's most productive mine," Preston explained to Nora. but the quality of ore has been declining as they go deeper. And the Morning Star has access to a richer section of the same vein, Nora concluded, understanding dawning. That's why Stewart wants this property so badly. Your father must have discovered this shortly before he died, Preston said. This survey is dated just 3 weeks ago. Collins examined the map more closely. There's more. These calculations in the margin, they're estimates of the vein's potential yield. If they're accurate, the Morning Star could outproduce every other mine in the district combined. The implications were staggering. What had seemed like a modest inheritance now represented a potential fortune, and explained why powerful men were willing to resort to kidnapping and violence to control it. We need to get this map to Sheriff Morgan, Preston decided, carefully folding it and securing it inside his vest. It's evidence of motive. As they prepared to leave, Nora asked for a few minutes to explore the small cabin that had served as her father's office and living quarters when he stayed at the mine. Preston agreed, though he insisted on checking the building first to ensure it was safe. The cabin was simple but comfortable, with a desk, bed, small stove, and bookshelves filled with mining manuals, geological texts, and a few novels. Everything was meticulously organized, reflecting the methodical nature Nora remembered in her father. On the desk sat a framed photograph, the last one taken of Nora with her parents before her mother's illness. She was about 16 in the image, standing between them in front of their Pennsylvania home, her father's hand resting proudly on her shoulder. He talked about you often, Preston said quietly from the doorway. Whenever he came to town, he'd show that photograph to anyone who would look. Nora turned, surprised. You knew him better than you let on. Preston nodded, a hint of regret in his expression. I didn't want to presume. But yes, I knew Jacob. He helped me when I first arrived in Granite about a year ago. I'd been wounded tracking a fugitive through these mountains, and he found me half frozen on this very property. Nursed me back to health in this cabin. Why didn't you tell me? Nora asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. At first, there wasn't time then. I wasn't sure how to bring it up. Preston moved further into the room, his gaze taking in the familiar surroundings. Jacob spoke so highly of you. He was planning to sell the mine and move back east to be near you once he'd proven its value. He wanted to give you the life he thought you deserved. Emotion welled in Nora's throat at these glimpses of her father's final months, his plans, his pride in her, his continued love despite the distance between them. Thank you for telling me, she managed. It means a great deal to know he wasn't alone out here. Preston's eyes met hers with unexpected warmth. He wasn't alone, and neither are you. The moment stretched between them, charged with something more than shared grief or common purpose. In the quiet of her father's cabin, surrounded by his belongings, Nora felt a connection to Preston deepening in ways she hadn't anticipated when he'd first rescued her from the Outlaws. The sound of Collins calling from outside broke the spell. Preston cleared his throat, stepping back slightly. We should head to town. The sheriff will want to see that map as soon as possible. Nora nodded, taking one last look around the cabin. I'll come back, she promised silently to her father's memory. Then, squaring her shoulders, she followed Preston outside to begin the ride back to Granite. The return journey was tense, with all 3 riders alert for any sign of trouble. But they encountered no one on the trail, arriving in Granite by mid-afternoon without incident. Sheriff Morgan was waiting at his office, and his expression turned grave as Preston spread the survey map on his desk and explained what they'd found. This changes everything, the sheriff said, running a hand through his graying hair. With evidence like this, we can get a judge to issue warrants for Stewart and his associates. Blackwell's testimony helps too, Preston added. Between his statements and this map, we have enough to prove motive and method. What about my father's death? Nora asked the question that had been troubling her since learning of Stewart's interest in the mine. Could it have been arranged? Sheriff Morgan exchanged a look with Preston. Doc Wilson certified it as pneumonia, and he's not a man who can be bought. But given what we know now, it might be worth asking him to reconsider the circumstances. I'll speak with him, Preston offered. He might recall details that seemed insignificant at the time but could be important in light of these developments. As they discussed next steps, a commotion erupted outside the sheriff's office. Moments later, a deputy burst through the door, his expression urgent. "Sheriff, there's trouble at the Stewart mining office. Edmund Stewart is destroying documents, and he's got armed men preventing anyone from entering the building." Morgan was on his feet immediately, checking his revolver. "Seems our investigation has been noticed. Preston, I need you with me. Miss Valenti, you should remain here where it's safe." "I'm coming too," Nora insisted, standing firmly. "This concerns me directly." Preston started to protest, but something in her expression must have convinced him. "Stay behind us," he conceded, "and if there's gunfire, you find cover immediately." The Stewart Mining Company occupied an imposing two-story building on Granite's Main Street. As they approached, Nora could see a crowd gathered outside, held back by several men with rifles standing guard at the entrance. Sheriff Morgan pushed through the onlookers, his badge clearly visible. "Edmund Stewart," he called loudly. "This is Sheriff Morgan. Come out and face me like a man instead of hiding behind your hired guns." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the front door opened and a distinguished-looking man in his 50s emerged. Tall and well-dressed, with silver at his temples and cold eyes, Edmund Stewart carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to power. "Sheriff Morgan," he acknowledged coolly, "this is private property. My men are simply ensuring our business isn't disrupted by this unruly mob." "The only disruption I'm concerned with is the evidence you're destroying," Morgan replied. "I have witnesses who say you've been burning documents for the past hour." Stewart's gaze flicked briefly to Preston, then settled with particular intensity on Nora. A flicker of recognition and calculation crossed his features. "Miss Valenti, I presume," he said, his tone shifting to false cordiality. "My condolences on your father's passing. I had hoped to discuss a business proposition with you upon your arrival. Perhaps we could speak privately." "Any proposition you have can be stated publicly," Nora replied evenly, refusing to be intimidated. "Especially since I now understand your interest in my father's property." Stewart's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Your father was a stubborn man who didn't recognize a generous offer when it was presented. I had hoped you would show better judgment. Better judgment than refusing to sell a mine worth 10 times your offering price," Preston interjected, stepping forward. "We know about the silver vein, Stewart. And we know about your arrangement with Frank Blackwell." A murmur ran through the crowd at this revelation. Stewart's carefully composed expression faltered for just a moment before he regained control. "Preposterous accusations," he said dismissively. "Frank Blackwell is a known criminal. Any claims he makes against respectable businessmen should be treated with appropriate skepticism." "It's not just Blackwell's word," Sheriff Morgan countered. "We have the survey map from the Morning Star mine showing exactly what Jacob Valenti discovered and exactly why you were so desperate to acquire his property." Stewart's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're making a serious mistake, Sheriff. Stewart Mining Company brings prosperity to this town. The jobs we provide, the business we generate. Granite would collapse without us." "Granite existed before you arrived, Mr. Stewart," Nora said, finding her voice. And it will continue long after your schemes are exposed. My father built something honest here. I won't allow his legacy to be stolen or corrupted." For a long moment, Stewart stared at her, naked calculation in his gaze. Then, with a slight nod to one of his men, he made his decision. "Arrest me if you must, Sheriff," he said with cold dignity, "but you'll find no evidence of wrongdoing. My conscience is clear." What happened next unfolded with stunning speed. As Sheriff Morgan stepped forward to place Stewart under arrest, one of the guards suddenly raised his rifle. Preston shouted a warning, drawing his own weapon as he moved to shield Nora. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. The crowd scattered in panic as bullets flew. Nora found herself pulled behind a water trough by Preston, his body protecting hers as chaos engulfed the street. Sheriff Morgan and his deputies exchanged shots with Stewart's men, while Stewart himself used the confusion to retreat back into the building. "Stay down," Preston ordered Nora, his voice intense. "I need to help Morgan." Before she could protest, he was gone, moving in a crouched run toward where the sheriff had taken cover behind a wagon. Through the mayhem, Nora watched as Preston and Morgan coordinated their movements, gradually outflanking Stewart's guards. One by one, the hired guns fell or surrendered, until only the building itself remained to be secured. When the gunfire finally ceased, Preston and Morgan approached the mining office cautiously, weapons ready. They disappeared inside while deputies secured the wounded and kept the crowd at bay. Minutes later, they emerged with Edmund Stewart in handcuffs, his dignified facade crumbling into fury and fear. "This isn't over," he spat as deputies led him toward the jail. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Morgan looked unimpressed. "Save it for the judge, Stewart. He'll be here in 2 days to hear the charges against you." As the street gradually returned to some semblance of normalcy, Nora emerged from her shelter. Preston immediately made his way to her side, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, checking her for injuries. "I'm fine," she assured him, though her hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline. "What about you and Sheriff Morgan? We're both unharmed. Can't say the same for Stewart's men." Preston's gaze softened as he looked at her. "You showed remarkable courage today." "I didn't do anything," Nora protested. "I hid while you and the sheriff faced the danger." "Courage isn't just about facing bullets," Preston said quietly. "It's about standing your ground when it matters most. You did that with Stewart before the shooting started." His words warmed her, as did the admiration in his eyes. For all the chaos and danger of the past few days, Nora realized she felt more alive, more purposeful than she had in years. And much of that had to do with the man standing before her. "What happens now?" she asked as they walked toward the sheriff's office. "Justice happens," Preston replied. "Stewart and his conspirators will face trial for their crimes. The Blackwell gang is finished, and the Morning Star mine remains yours to develop as you see fit." "I know nothing about running a mine," Nora admitted. Preston smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious features. "Your father left detailed plans, and there are honest men in Granite who would be proud to work the Morning Star. I think you'll find you have more resources than you realize." At the sheriff's office, they found Morgan already processing paperwork for Stewart's arrest. "Judge Carter will be here Friday," he informed them. "Until then, Stewart and his men will enjoy our hospitality." "What about the mine?" Nora asked. "Is it safe for me to return there?" "I'm assigning deputies to guard it until this situation is fully resolved," Morgan assured her. "No one will interfere with your property now that Stewart's scheme is exposed." As evening approached, Preston suggested they return to Mrs. Wilson's boarding house for dinner. "You've had enough excitement for one day," he said with gentle authority, "and I promised Doc Wilson I'd have him check my wound again." The boarding house was a welcome refuge after the tensions of the day. Mrs. Wilson fussed over them both, insisting that Nora rest while she prepared a special dinner to celebrate their safe return. Later, after the meal had been cleared and the other boarders had retired to their rooms, Nora and Preston once again found themselves on the back porch, watching as stars appeared above the mountains. "I received a telegram this afternoon," Preston said after a comfortable silence. "From the marshal's office in Denver." Something in his tone made Nora turn to study his profile. "Good news or bad?" "That depends," he replied, a hint of uncertainty in his voice that she hadn't heard before. "They've offered me a permanent assignment in Granite. The town has grown enough to warrant its own federal marshal, separate from the sheriff's office." "That's wonderful," Nora said sincerely. "The people here respect you. You'll do well in that position." Preston turned to face her directly. "I haven't accepted yet. I wanted to ask you something first." Her heart quickened at his serious expression. "What is it?" "Your plans," he said simply. "Now that you know the value of the Morning Star, will you stay in Granite to develop it, or sell and return east?" The question caught her by surprise, though she realized it had been forming in her own mind as well. "I've been thinking about that," she admitted. "When I first arrived, I assumed I would settle my father's affairs and leave. I had a life waiting for me in Boston teaching at a girls' school, a comfortable but predictable future." "And now?" Preston asked, his blue eyes intent on hers. "Now I've seen what my father built here. I've experienced this town and its people, their strength, their kindness to a stranger." Nora smiled softly. "I've discovered that perhaps I'm more my father's daughter than I realized. The thought of managing the Morning Star, of continuing what he started, it feels right." Relief and something warmer spread across Preston's features. "Then I'll accept the position," he said. "Granite should be a safe place for honest citizens to build their futures. I'd like to be part of ensuring that." The unspoken implication hung between them that his decision to stay was connected to hers. Nora felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with lingering caution. "Preston," she began hesitantly, "I'm grateful for everything you've done for me since the moment you shot that rope and pulled me onto your horse. But I don't want your decision to be based on some sense of obligation or protection." "It isn't," he assured her, taking a step closer. "Nora, when I found you being dragged by those outlaws, I was doing my duty as a lawman. But somewhere between that moment and now, things changed." "For me too," she admitted softly. Preston reached for her hand, his touch gentle but certain. "I've lived a solitary life for many years. The work I do often demands it, but these past days with you, I've begun to imagine a different future." "What kind of future?" Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "One where duty and happiness aren't mutually exclusive. Where a marshal might find time to court a certain mine owner if she were amenable." His eyes searched hers. "Would she be amenable, do you think?" Nora felt a smile bloom across her face, matching the warmth spreading through her chest. "I think she would be very amenable indeed." Preston's answering smile transformed his face, erasing the lines of worry and vigilance that usually marked his features. With exquisite gentleness, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that promised more to come. "Then I believe we both have futures to build in Granite," he said, his voice rich with possibilities. As they stood together on the porch, the night air cool around them but warmth blossoming between them, Nora marveled at the strange path that had led her here. What had begun as a journey to settle her father's affairs had become the start of an unexpected new chapter in her life, one filled with purpose, promise, and the prospect of love with this remarkable man who had come to her rescue when she needed it most. The days that followed unfolded with a sense of purpose and renewed hope. Judge Carter arrived from Denver as scheduled and presided over a preliminary hearing where Edmund Stewart and his associates were formally charged with conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against them, including Frank Blackwell's testimony and the documents recovered from Stewart's office, was substantial enough that the judge ordered them held for trial in Denver the following month. During this time, Nora began the process of truly settling into Granite. With Preston's help, she moved into her father's house, a modest but well-built cabin on the edge of town that offered views of both the mountains and the bustling Main Street. Though small, it had a comfortable parlor, 2 bedrooms, a functional kitchen, and a covered porch perfect for watching the sunset. "He built it with you in mind," Preston observed as they arranged her few belongings in the space. The bookshelves, the writing desk by the window, he created a home where he hoped you would join him someday. The thought brought both sadness and comfort to Nora. "I wish I had come sooner," she admitted. "We lost so much time." "He understood your life in Boston," Preston assured her. "He was proud of your teaching, your independence. He wanted you to choose your own path, not feel obligated to join him here." "And now I have chosen," she said with quiet certainty. "This is where I belong." With the immediate danger from Stewart and his men neutralized, Nora turned her attention to the Morning Star mine. The survey map had proven accurate. The silver vein was rich and accessible, promising years of productive operation. After consulting with Preston and Sheriff Morgan, she hired a respected foreman named Thomas Jenkins, who had worked briefly for her father before Stewart Mining's expansion had dominated the local labor market. Jenkins assembled a small but experienced crew, and within 2 weeks, the Morning Star was operational again. Nora insisted on fair wages and safer working conditions than were common in most mines, decisions that initially raised eyebrows but quickly earned her the loyalty of her workers. "They'd walk through fire for you now," Preston remarked after visiting the mine one afternoon. "Word spreading that the Morning Star treats men like human beings, not machinery." "It's simply good business," Nora replied. "Contented workers are more productive and less prone to accidents. Besides, these men have families in Granite. Their well-being affects the entire community." This perspective that business success and community welfare were interconnected rather than opposing forces became the foundation of Nora's approach to running her inheritance. As the weeks passed, and the mine began producing significant amounts of silver ore, she reinvested portions of the profit into improvements for both the operation and the men who worked it. Throughout this period, Preston was a constant presence in her life, though his new duties as federal marshal kept him busy. Stewart's removal had created a power vacuum that attracted opportunistic elements to the region, requiring vigilance and occasional shows of force to maintain order. Still, he made time each day to see Nora, often joining her for dinner at her cabin or escorting her to town functions. Their courtship progressed with a deliberate pace that honored both their growing feelings and the proprieties expected by Granite's surprisingly traditional society. "People are talking," Sheriff Morgan's wife, Eliza, informed Nora one afternoon as they organized donations for the town's small school. "They say Marshal Archer has never shown interest in any woman until you arrived. Is that so?" Nora replied noncommittally, though she couldn't suppress a small smile. "It is," Eliza confirmed with matching smile. "Tom says he's never seen Preston so content. You're good for him, Nora. He needed someone who understands his sense of duty but reminds him there's more to life." This observation touched Nora deeply. She had indeed come to understand Preston's dedication to justice and protection qualities that mirrored her own growing commitment to her father's legacy and the community he had chosen. The turning point in their relationship came unexpectedly, nearly 2 months after Nora's arrival in Granite. A severe storm had swept through the mountains, causing minor flooding and damage throughout the region. Preston had been away for 3 days, helping isolated homesteaders and checking mining camps in the high country. When he finally returned to town, exhausted and mud-splattered, his first stop was Nora's cabin. She welcomed him with relief, having worried throughout his absence. "You should be resting, not trudging up here in this weather," she scolded gently as she helped him remove his sodden coat. "I needed to see you," he said simply, his eyes conveying what words could not. That through the long, difficult days of rescue work and dangerous travel, the thought of returning to her had sustained him. Nora prepared hot coffee and a simple meal while Preston cleaned up, changing into dry clothes he now kept at her home for such occasions. When he emerged from the spare bedroom, the exhaustion was still evident in his face, but something else shone through, a clarity of purpose that caught her attention. They ate together before the fire, Preston describing the conditions in the mountains and the families he had helped evacuate from threatened areas. Nora listened, struck by his matter-of-fact recounting of acts that others would have called heroic. When the meal was finished and they sat side by side watching the flames, Preston turned to her with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Nora," he began, his voice low and serious, "these past days made me realize something I think I've known since I first saw you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "What is that?" "Life is unpredictable and sometimes dangerous, especially in places like Granite. I've always accepted that risk as part of my duty." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "But now, the thought of leaving things unsaid between us seems like a greater risk than any I face in my work." Nora's breath caught as Preston shifted to face her more directly, his blue eyes intense in the firelight. "I love you," he said simply. "Not just for your courage or your kindness, though I admire both. I love who you are, your determination, your vision for the mine, the way you've embraced this community as your own." Joy bloomed in Nora's chest, spreading warmth throughout her body. "I love you too," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "I think I began falling in love with you the moment you pulled me onto your horse, not because you rescued me, but because of the person I glimpsed even in that chaotic moment." Preston's smile transformed his face, erasing the weariness of the past days. With gentle reverence, he cupped her face in his hands and leaned forward to kiss her for the first time, a tender, questioning touch that quickly deepened as Nora responded with the same certainty she felt in her heart. When they finally drew apart, Preston kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I want to build a life with you, Nora, not someday or when things are calmer. Now, if you'll have me." "Are you proposing, Marshal Archer?" she asked, a teasing smile playing at her lips though her eyes remained serious. "I believe I am, Miss Valenti," he confirmed, matching her tone before growing earnest again. "I don't have a ring with me. This wasn't how I planned to ask. But I don't want to wait another day to know if you might someday be my wife." Nora's answer required no deliberation. "Yes," she said simply, her heart too full for elaborate speeches. "I would be honored to be your wife." The kiss that followed sealed their promise to each other, a commitment born of shared danger, mutual respect, and a love that had grown stronger with each passing day. News of their engagement spread quickly through Granite, met with widespread approval and genuine goodwill. Many townspeople felt, It brought their community full circle, Jacob Valenti's daughter finding happiness with the lawman, who had once been saved by her father. They were married 6 weeks later in Granite's small church, with Sheriff Morgan standing as Preston's best man and Eliza Morgan attending Nora. The entire town turned out for the celebration that followed, with miners from the Morning Star providing an honor guard and Mrs. Wilson overseeing an elaborate wedding feast. "Your father would be proud," Thomas Jenkins told Nora during the festivities. "Not just of the mine's success, but of the life you're building here. He always said you had his determination, and your mother's heart seems he was right on both counts." That night, in the cabin that would serve as their home until they could build something larger, Preston and Nora began their life together with the deep connection of two people who had found in each other not just love, but a shared purpose. "I have something for you," Preston said as they sat before the fire, the sounds of the celebration still faintly audible from town. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I wanted you to have this, even though you've already made me the happiest man in Colorado territory by becoming my wife." Inside the box was a ring of exquisite craftsmanship, a silver band set with a single diamond that caught the firelight in mesmerizing patterns. "It's beautiful," Nora breathed as he slid it onto her finger beside the simple gold band they had exchanged in the church. "The silver is from the first ore processed at the Morning Star after you reopened it," Preston explained. "Jenkins helped me arrange it. The diamond belonged to my mother, the one thing of hers I've carried with me through all my wanderings." The significance of these combined elements, her present, his past, their shared future, moved Nora deeply. "I'll treasure it always," she promised, sealing the words with a kiss that expressed what lay beyond language. Their life together unfolded with both challenges and joys. The Morning Star mine continued to prosper under Nora's guidance, eventually becoming Granite's largest employer after Stewart Mining was dissolved, following Edmund Stewart's conviction. Preston's role as federal marshal kept him busy but fulfilled, especially as the region gradually became more settled and less lawless. They built a larger home the following year on a piece of land between town and the mine, a beautiful 2-story house with wide porches and large windows that captured the spectacular mountain views. It became a gathering place for friends and a welcoming beacon for newcomers to Granite. In the spring of their second year of marriage, their family expanded with the birth of their son, Jacob Thomas Archer, named for both Nora's father and the loyal foreman who had helped establish the Morning Star's reputation. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, Elizabeth Rose, whose arrival coincided with Granite's formal incorporation as a proper town rather than a mining settlement. As the children grew, so did the community around them. Granite evolved from a rough mining town into a proper small city, with Nora and Preston at the center of many civic improvements. A proper school was built, followed by a hospital, a larger church, and eventually even an opera house that brought culture and entertainment to what had once been a remote outpost. Through it all, Preston and Nora remained partners in every sense, supporting each other's endeavors, weathering occasional storms, both literal and figurative, and building a legacy that honored Jacob Valenti's vision while creating something uniquely their own. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, they hosted a celebration at their home for the entire town. As twilight descended and lanterns illuminated their expansive garden, Preston found Nora standing alone for a moment, gazing toward the mountains where the Morning Star mine continued its operations day and night. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, slipping an arm around her waist. Nora leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his shoulder. "Not one," she replied with absolute certainty. Every path that led me here, even being kidnapped by outlaws, was worth it for the life we've built." Preston chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her. "I've never been so grateful for tracking notorious criminals. Without the Blackwell gang, I might never have found you." "You would have," Nora said with conviction, turning to face the man who had transformed from rescuer to husband to the very center of her world. "Some things are simply meant to be." As their guests called for them to join the dancing that had begun on the lawn, Preston pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You're right, as always. Finding you, loving you, it was inevitable from the moment I saw you." Hand in hand, they rejoined their celebration, surrounded by friends, children, and the community that had become their extended family. From a desperate rescue on a dusty trail to this moment of shared joy and accomplishment, their journey had been extraordinary, but somehow also perfectly right, as though the universe had conspired from the beginning to bring them together in this wild, beautiful corner of Colorado. And as they danced beneath stars that had witnessed their beginning, a frightened woman, a determined lawman, and a severed rope that had changed everything, Nora and Preston Archer embraced the life they had created together. A life of purpose, passion, and enduring love in the heart of what had once been the Wild West.